So just some things I think to identify first before we begin is I know that I have a varied group here, and so you can't all personally answer this question. Though if we were in a classroom setting, I'd want to know where each of you are at. So is a question of what is my role? And that's really important to establish. So I'm going to introduce me. I have a couple different roles at the university and in my career. So the way that I interact through a trauma-informed lens when I'm operating as a teacher is slightly different than when I'm operating as a counselor, right? And so really understanding if you're an administrator, if you're a social worker, if you're a counselor, a therapist, working with the family or working with the individual, really understanding what your role is and what it isn't is, I think, critically important to understanding what to do with some of this information. One of the reasons I say that is I know that I have teachers in the room, and something I'm particularly sensitive about when talking about trauma-informed schools to teachers and administrators is teaching is already, and especially teaching in public and private schools, are already such a heavy job. It seems like every day the role gets pieces added to it, and I'm sensitive to that. My background's in education, and I student taught in a couple different schools, and I saw that firsthand. And I saw the way teachers did a fantastic job with the resources that they had, and even the resources that they didn't have. But really understanding like what is my role as a teacher. And that's important, especially because that means you probably won't be in the position to know all of your students one-on-one in depth enough to know this extensive trauma history to make sense of some of the behaviors you're seeing. But if you're looking through a trauma-informed lens, you won't necessarily have to. Because you're operating under a set of principles that are for all, but especially informed by all the information and the data that we have about trauma. So really understanding. So asking yourself some of this as you're listening. Some of you are parents probably as well. So this will apply in different ways. What's my role as a parent with some of this information? As a churchgoer, it's really important to identify that. Some other things I think too, we're as believers, trauma is a significant form of suffering. And so our theology about suffering really gets activated when we engage this topic. Our questions about suffering come up, and I am just as dismayed and perplexed by suffering and how huge suffering is as everybody else in this room. But really it challenges what we really believe about suffering and what we really believe about God's sovereignty in suffering. And some of that might come up with you today, but those questions naturally come up, and it's a wonderful opportunity to wrestle with some of them. And I have some resources at the end I'll direct you towards. And then finally, I believe the most important part of becoming trauma-informed is the person of the counselor, the therapist, the parent, the teacher. And that necessarily means asking yourself as a caregiver, as people in authority of other people, especially people that have been traumatized and in power positions over them. The task on you and some really practical steps to take today is to assess emotional and spiritual maturity in yourself. And really identifying the ways and areas in your life that is going to be necessary for you to grow in. Your position as authority, people and members in lives of people that are traumatized can be so powerfully good and healing and curative and modeling, or it could potentially be re-traumatizing. And some of that has to do with emotional maturity and in the way that I think about spiritual maturity. So really asking yourself some of those questions that come up, and I'll give some opportunities as we move forward to engage with that a little bit more. So I talk about children very specifically. We know children grow into adults, but the impact of adversity and trauma on developing children is really important to understand. It has a lot of learning implications. And I think even if you're working with primarily an adult population, understanding this, and I found in working through this with a couple of my adult students, this has been really clarifying and helpful to understand for a variety of reasons, and we'll go into that. So a case study. So imagining yourself as a teacher. So you have a student, 4-year-old boy named Alex, first year, is excited to come to school, passionate, probably really fun to be around. But at times his behavior becomes out of control and he screams or curses at classmates and teachers, destroys classroom materials and other children's artwork, all seemingly without cause or really an understanding of what was triggering that behavior. Another case study would be Kiara, our 7-year-old second grader who bright, does well academically, but is starting to fall behind, even though she never misses a day of school, spends most of her time daydreaming or, seemingly in another place. Really difficult, you're observing as a teacher, difficulty with social relationships. And you're kind of engaging the help of the teacher from the previous year to make sense of some of what you're seeing. So with Alex, you'll see explosive behavior that's very disruptive. And in Kiara's case, you're seeing withdrawal, right? And you're seeing a different side of really trauma exposure. And one thing I do want to note that this is why it's important to apply a trauma-informed lens versus having to know the background of each student and where the behaviors are coming from, because in a class of 25 students and you're one teacher with maybe one aide, you will focus on Alex. You'll focus on Alex's behavior, or focus on managing his behavior. You'll focus on trying to lessen his disruption. Class will in some way start to revolve around managing Alex. And if Kiara was in the same class, she's just the quiet, compliant child, right? And so we want to, of course, have a view of each child as unique and individuals. I think in practicalities of our current economic world and the way schools are set up, this is really difficult to know. And just even going back to some of the brain science, expecting them to share these backgrounds. So this is their backstory. Alex is often alone and has both witnessed domestic violence and experienced it himself. So his backstory is one of exposure to domestic violence and feeling the effects of physical abuse. And Kiara was sexually abused, between the ages of 2 and 4 by a cousin. So, and what becomes unclear or teachers aren't always aware of is that withdrawal is also a symptom of trauma exposure. Dissociation, right? That daydreaming piece of it. So really seeing through a trauma-informed lens, I think caters to the whole versus I need to know Alex's story because there's a whole lot of reasons why Alex as a 4-year-old won't be able to articulate his story to you. He will communicate, and most trauma is communicated through behavior and through relational patterns.
Ashlyn, can I interrupt you for 1 minute? The PowerPoint is not advancing.
Oh, it isn't advancing.
Right. So if you can hit the slideshow, beginning slideshow at the beginning.
It's frozen.
Is it advancing now?
Yes. Okay.
Attempt.
Okay, that's perfect. There you go. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Okay. Is it advancing now? Okay. All right. So, and these are some statistics. I won't go through all of them, but the picture that they paint for us is that trauma is not unique. Adverse experiences that children face and very young children face are not the small majority, the way that it once was thought of, even 20 years ago, so fairly recently. The exposure to adversity is actually really commonplace and really high. And so, you don't want to look at also, this is another piece of needing to know the story. And a problem with needing to know the story is Alex and Kiara could experience something, and as you see in their case examples, express it really different. Their bodies and brains, depending on a lot of different risk and protective factors, can assimilate, make sense of, and heal from trauma really, really differently. So it's not necessarily, we don't always look at the severity of an event as like that means that the trauma response will be really severe. It's, you look at layering of trauma experiences, what types, what kinds of protective factors some, a child or an adult has around them, or risk factors that could exacerbate the way trauma experiences are processed in the body and the brain. So it's sometimes we hear stories and we put them on a spectrum from bad to worse, right? And I think that's an unhelpful kind of position to go through, because it's very specific the way trauma impacts and engages with a person that experiences it. So it's not so much what, it's kind of how, not what alone is experienced, but how that trauma and those experiences are processed. Some of the pieces of trauma, some definitions of trauma is it's an emotional, psychological, and behavioral response to a terrible event. And normalizing immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. That's why, what happened or what's going on with you, that type of questioning isn't necessarily helpful because trauma is first processed in the part of the brain that is the fear and the fear response center in the brain. And so your front part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, is really responsible for helping make sense of, tell a logical narrative of, wrap words around events. And so it's a piece of the reason why Alex wouldn't be able to necessarily tell you what's going on with him and wrap words around that. One, because developmentally that's not appropriate for a 4-year-old to be able to do. His behavior is his communication. His relationship to his teacher is also an important form of communication. That is how trauma is going to get communicated most often. Not I'm acting like this because this happened to me. That's a really mature, but often kind of, that's not a normal way of being able to connect things immediately after kind of experiencing a trauma. The next definition I like because it couches trauma in that what's unique about traumatic and adverse experiences is that it overwhelms the ability or capacity to cope with what is experienced. So it adds to that by it overwhelms our ability to even make sense of or understand what's going on. So just some examples of trauma and adverse experiences. Some of them you might naturally think of when you think of trauma, abuse, natural disasters, but some of the other pieces, this constant exposure kids and adults have to violence, both real life violence and pretend violence or violence in movies and TV, this constant exposure to the message, the world is dangerous, over and over and over again can be adverse and have adverse effects. Witnessing and experiencing community violence. So just think about how some of these things layer. Death, divorce is considered an adverse experience. Separation and divorce are also living with a caretaker with undiagnosed mental illness or substance abuse, and an incarcerated parent or caretaker. So I want to talk just a little bit about understanding the way trauma impacts the brain, and especially the bodies and brains of children. And so I'll talk about the image in a moment, but this text down in the bottom is important, especially for teachers to understand. So a review of the data shows that much of early childhood trauma actually never reaches the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So the brain that is responsible for speech and communication. So what happened, right? A lot of it never actually even reaches that part of the brain in order for that to be known by caregivers and teachers and therapists. So there is a correlation between trauma in childhood and early life stressors that has potentially a lasting impact on that skill, right? Just what happened, but also you will see in a minute how that extends to other parts of the learning process. So verbalizing the impact, that's why much of the literature that's coming out of trauma-informed practices don't focus on the narrative of trauma. It focuses on the community's or the individual's ability to regulate their emotional state and their body and brain through a whole number of physiological interventions that are really aimed at, when I lose control or I feel really triggered, I don't need to know about what, because that's a logical part of the brain. That's not what's operating. It goes offline actually when a person is triggered or in trauma. So it won't make logical sense, but having the tools to be able to apply and calm yourself down or address the emotional state that you're currently in, or the panic, the hyperarousal or the hypoarousal that happens with trauma. So that's really important. There was a question about, certain communities' distrust of counseling. And I think that's wrapped up in disclosure, what someone will disclose. And obviously as mandated reporters and teachers and therapists, we want to know if abuse is happening to prevent it. But I think when it comes to a cultural or community response to, counseling, if the community or the family is involved in tools and learning tools and applying tools that are aimed at physiological calming, really, strategies, that can be something that would be helpful for the unit, the community, and that person, that student that you're trying to address. And it doesn't actually have to do with disclosure. It has to do with developing a set of tools that will enable you to regulate your emotions and calm your body. Some of this impact, especially on repeated trauma on the brain, is it does decrease your frontal lobe functioning, which is high. Almost all of our education system is built around the assumption that your frontal lobe operates the way it's supposed to operate. It is responsible for executive functioning, which some of what that means is planning and engaging in goal-directed behavior. I know how much time when I get home, I can plan out my time so that I can eat dinner, go to bed at a good time, get my homework done. It assumes that ability, right? And that frontal lobe is responsible for, that's an executive function, planning and engaging in time and planning out your time. So you'll see kind of one of the indicators of trauma could be the way people tend to be time blind. Almost having no connection with timing and how to plan time. That can be a clue or an indicator. And that's also something you can build into your class day. That's why schedules are so helpful and important for people that have experienced trauma. They know what to expect. They know that when this activity ends, this activity begins. And that's repeated. And that can be really comforting and stabilizing to somebody that's experienced trauma. The frontal lobe is also in charge of helping us understand that if I stay up till 3 a.m., I'm going to be tired the next day. It's going to impact the way that I can listen and learn. So that recognizing there's future consequences and being able to understand there's a consequence if I choose this behavior. There's a consequence if I lose my mind in my classroom and start to wreck classmates' artwork, right? There's a consequence after that. The frontal lobe's also in charge of that. So that's decreased because of trauma exposure. That ability to make that connection won't be as present. Choosing between good and bad actions, overriding and suppressing socially unacceptable responses to your emotional state. And so you kind of get this picture that's a really important part of the brain, right? And so if repeated trauma exposure limits that ability in some way, it decreases that functionality, you're going to see a direct result in a classroom setting if you're in charge of education. And also there's going to be sensitivity, this reactivity, this impulsivity, because their body and their brain is more attuned to keeping them safe. Their alarm system is on alert, then it is, able to engage with material in a calm body state, or not experiencing emotional or dysregulation. So some manifestations in classrooms, there is a decreased ability to learn, actually the ability to learn for a person that has experienced a trauma recently or chronically is exposed to traumatizing or adverse situations. So there's an inhibition, as we just talked about, in higher level thinking, ability to make connections. And again, this is when I've worked with adult people that have experienced trauma. That made their experiences, and often frustrating, isolating experiences in early education, make a whole lot more sense to them, and highlighted for them some really important, like, oh, I'm not dumb. I grew up kind of thinking I was really stupid, not understanding, right, because of what I experienced actually impacted my ability to learn. The difficulty in creating attachment, we're going to talk about attachment in a minute, and developing supportive relationship makes a lot of sense. Trauma, it can be a result of disrupted attachment, but it also can be a symptom, not the source of trauma, but a symptom that I experienced something, and my attachment figure, my caretaker, didn't have the tools to help me make sense or work through or even regulate or model regulation to me. And so this pattern is going to, become part of my relational way of operating. So I just wanted to show you this, because if you think back to Alex is 4, and his behavior is going to get labeled, possibly diagnosed, and possibly medicated. And usually that type of behavior is seen through the lens of ADHD. And so you see, and I just kind of laid out this table, a comparison to ADHD, something called oppositional and defiance disorder, and typical trauma responses in children. And what you'll notice is there is a lot of overlap. So using a trauma lens is, and as a role of teacher, your role is not to diagnose, it's to alert the other supports in your administration that there might be an issue, that to get testing, to get the answers as to what the issue is. So your role is not to diagnose ADHD like that and start to address it. But what I do want you to just observe is that there's overlap. So perhaps you would label something ODD that is actually a really normal trauma response for a child to have. And so, but those are shaping labels. That shapes educational opportunities. It shapes social opportunities. So 4-year-old Alex will likely be labeled by not just his classmates, not just his teachers, classmates, and treated differently because of what they're seeing, right? And because of the way the teachers interact with him as well, right? That's all a learning, really rich learning environment. But those things have implications and trajectories. And so really that is, I think, a really important implication for a trauma-informed lens as well. Alex would be a bad kid. You just kind of see him as a bad kid, and the focus would be on the management of the behavior. So instead of kind of also looking at how to create a classroom in which Alex can operate in, that's good for the rest of the classmates as well to operate in. So I just wanted to show a little bit of this attachment style chart, because again, you will feel one of the reasons I care so deeply about us, whoever's in this room and whoever is willing to listen to me, becoming really mature, trauma-informed caretakers of people, is we will experience people's trauma whether we know their story or not relationally. And that can bring up a lot for people. That can bring up a lot for teachers, and that can bring up a lot for therapists. That can bring up a lot for administrators and parents, right? You will feel the impact, whether you're the source or totally uninvolved, relationally, of somebody's trauma. And a lot of that has to do with attachment.
You said you were this one.
Sorry.
What do you mean?
I think
Oh,
someone's
with
mic is on.
land. Oh, okay.
With you, I'd have been this.
Avoidant dismissive. I think
So I was getting nervous there. We're gonna hear. So looking at this attachment style, this is largely influenced by our first early caretakers, but it can. The good news about attachment is it can heal, and in adult attached relationships, you can see neurological pathways of attachment that have been disrupted in early childhood or adolescence be healed and actually form new pathways to securely attach. So just so you kind of have that awareness. But this is what these are what attachment behaviors look like in children, and what attachment behavior, same attachment style looks like in adults. So you'll see it a little bit differently, but you'll feel this relational. I'm just going to paint the picture a little bit of maybe what an anxious, preoccupied attachment. So I'm a therapist. So some of what this looks like is pretty quickly in the relationship building part of a therapeutic alliance, you could feel that that person has attached and trusts you very, very quickly. Which as an early therapist might feel really good. You're like, oh, that's how good I am. But really, once you kind of have more experiences and trauma-informed lens, it could also say, I haven't earned that. And so I'm interested in why that's present. And it could indicate an anxious attachment style, right? So the tendency to want to cling to a caregiver and want that care. And when disrupted, it's very difficult to get over that relational disappointment or manage that relational disappointment. It's disruptive for a longer period of time. It's also possible that you'll experience some of the relational implications of a traumatized client having avoidant or dismissive attachment style, which can feel rejecting. Right. And if you're kind of making sense and you're personalizing everything you experience from your client or your student, that you're probably going to respond in an emotionally immature way to either scenario, where you'll like and foster the clingy type of connection, the needy type of connection without understanding what it could be coming from, and dread, dislike, take it personally, have your worth attached to the avoidant dismissive style of relating. So that's, again, it's so important, I think, on my end, and I'll reiterate this 20 more times, to understand that, to be able to depersonalize some of what you're experiencing in relationships, even close relationships, not a client, not a student, people in your life. This lens isn't something you take off when you go home. It's something that you can look at through and make sense of relational behavior across the board. Not to dismiss it or then take on, okay, I need to take on the role of a counselor to this person in my life, a friend or a family member. That's an understanding a role. That's really important. But it's understand and almost create space between the way that their behavior is impacting you and how much it's attached to you. And really being able to differentiate that. Okay, so just some challenges I think this presents to all of us, that reactivity, the relinquishing the old idea of how classrooms should operate, and expectations around that. This changes some pieces of that. And I need to move through a couple things, but so again, kind of this provides a couple different opportunities. This PowerPoint will be available to you as well. So if you want to kind of create, go back and look. So to me, there's some really practical implications of this that I think span the counselor's role and the teacher's role. And so SAMHSA kind of put out these 6 principles to a trauma-informed approach, prioritizing and understanding what safety is. Safety is not letting somebody who is traumatized do whatever they want, right? Letting Alex destroy the classroom, right? That doesn't feel safe to Alex. That doesn't feel safe to the community. That doesn't feel safe to the teacher. Well, I experience this is why I'm acting like that. Understanding and creating and maintaining boundaries is really important for safety, and really understanding what safety is. Being a trustworthy, transparent person, creating trustworthy and transparent spaces in people's life, creating peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So some of the tips that this outlines is any way you can incorporate movement, expression, non-verbal ways of expressing. Again, because that frontal lobe is in charge of that. Any ways that you can encourage that type of expression, using the body and engaging the body and breath and expression and processing of emotional states. There's some things called tapping and other really interesting strategies around this that's been developed and implemented school-wide. And also transitions and communicating transitions. So preparing in advance for any deviations and change, creating really predictably safe routines, increasing choices. And again, I think this applies to counseling settings as well. Transition assistance. So that means if at the therapist life, if you have a transition coming up, you're communicating that as much and as far in advance as you can and talking about the implications and talking through and processing what that is. Really being able to remain calm and exercise self-control, maintain empathy and support, even, and I think that's why identifying own personal triggers is really important. And so I tried to do this. So recently in a college class I was teaching, we were reading a book. And before we read the book, I don't know all my students' backgrounds and histories. So I'm saying things like, this book has a sexual assault in it. This book goes into this type of detail about it, right? So I'm trying to prepare them so that they aren't surprised by something potentially triggering. And we don't always know everybody's triggers, but it's something I think when you do know sensitive areas, you can be communicating about them, and giving time. So I train counselors, and in my last class, giving time to ground, practice grounding techniques, practicing mindfulness, breathing, body relaxation before and after kind of engaging with difficult material is important. So college education, so not even thinking about how important that is for children to learn, but implementing that in the classrooms that we have and interactions we have with adults. Okay, this piece identifies, and if you want to take a picture of the screen, I've done this, so if you've been in my class before, this should be a familiar list. This is what is, and there's obviously things that can be added to it, but what does being an emotionally safe person actually look and sound like? If we're operational, if we're making that very, very functional, what does that look like? And so sometimes when I'm like working with this list, I'll have people take a picture and ask someone that's very close to them or loved and in a relationship with them, what they do well as far as emotional safety and what they could improve on. And I think that's important, and it's a really practical thing you can do today, engage in this kind of vulnerable conversation, but that this gets communicated. you know, my weaknesses in this area get communicated to my clients and my students. My strengths get communicated, and I really want to understand what they are and what I need to improve on to be a continual dedication to being an emotionally safe, emotionally mature, spiritually mature person. And I think we can't be spiritually mature without being emotionally mature. And I suggest a book that talks a lot about that as well. So I did add some resources because I know you're coming from a lot of different places, and I have to wrap up to answer some questions. But these are some things from my personal life that have shaped my understanding of how to interact with suffering in a godly way, and wrestle with my own questions around suffering in a godly way. Not that I have more answers than the other person, but I think there is a way to interact with questions and dismay in a godly way, and a way to interact with questions and dismay in an ungodly way. So some of these resources have helped me and just developed me in personal maturity as well. If you're a teacher, I just want to director or administrator, I have these other resources that have 3 websites that have very specific, very targeted information on how to become a trauma-informed school, how to build trauma-informed curriculum. And I wanted to just draw your attention to that to help kind of whatever this added to your understanding to enhance that. All right, thank you guys. I'll take questions, and Gwen's going to ask me some of the questions.
Yeah, we've had quite a few questions that have come through the chat, as well as questions that you all submitted on your registration form. So we thank you for those questions, and we're going to transition into that time. Ashlyn, how do you balance urgency of school performance with also taking time to slow down, build rapport, and connect with the student?
I think that it's in one way the question makes me think about the very real pressures on teachers, specifically that, especially in K through 12, the assessment, how much funding your school is going to get is dependent on how well you do on certain assessments and school-wide assessments. So the pressure is very real, and that often takes priority and time in the classroom to engage that very real pressure. So there is an urgency of school performance and how well academically. I think what the research says is, and I think probably if you look at the schools that do well can bear some of this out, is that learning happens in the community, and it happens within, if you can establish safety. So, I do think it should be a priority in the beginning of establishing a classroom community. And I think that has very real implications and connections to how well a student is going to perform academically. I think that's what the research indicates. So it's not something we want to kind of add on, but seeing it really as, if I want my school to perform well in these assessments, if I want my students to perform well in my assessments, this type of environment has been, empirically supported to support that possibility. And so it's not like this would be nice to do, but learning is first. It's learning, especially for some students that have experienced trauma or live in traumatized communities. That's not a nice thing to have. It's actually like a requirement to be able to do the tasks and learning that you want and need them to do. So I think it just reframes the question a little bit to, I don't think we get some of that performance. I don't think the data shows we get that performance without being able to establish as much safety, again, I went back to this slide just because I think it helps, as much safety and community as we can in our classrooms, and modeling that. And so that, yeah, there's just some interesting research that shows the schools that have done that well and what they've seen from implementing things like tapping or yoga or body and emotion awareness into their curriculum.
Very good, very good. The next question is, as a male counselor, I worry my presence alone might be a trigger for victims of abuse. How can I work with this beneficially?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think really understanding first all the identities that we do bring. And so I don't know immediately if, you know, who this person has experienced traumatic response, you know, interactions with. So I think as a male, usually it's kind of almost a stereotype that males are going to be the main perpetrators. And that's sometimes the case, right? So kind of bringing an awareness of myself as a female, myself as a male into the room. And I think that's why things like intakes where a client expresses their, and I'm thinking clients, express their preference is really important, in honoring that preference. And a couple times I've had clients that would prefer a male. And so very first session, I'm processing that with them. I'm asking if that's going to get in the way of the therapeutic work that they need to do. I'm acknowledging it. I'm saying it's important. I'm not having an ego about it. I'm not saying, no, I can really help you. I'm honoring that choice and seeing if there's something that, if that's something, one, we can work through, but also something that I need to advocate for them, that know they need. Advocating for them would be transferring them and you know, or referring them to somebody that they feel most comfortable with. So I think really acknowledging that, because I think it can also be really a helpful, if that person was traumatized by a male specifically, that they have somebody safe and respectful as a model for that. I think that can be, it's not, I don't always think of it as a negative. I think it can be a positive, but I think the client has to really feel like they have power and choice, especially if the gender issue is deeply important to them.
Okay, very good, very good. You were talking about attachment style or relating. There's a question, when can you say that someone has earned someone's trust? And what are some signs of this?
I think I go back to my emotionally safe picture of a person. So, and I think, I'll just go back to that slide. Oh, wait. So it's first embodying some of these things to a trustworthy person. If we're replacing that word with emotional safety, like this is what they're looking for. And for people that have been hurt a lot, there's often tests of trust that they do with somebody. How are you going to respond? And especially this plays out in therapy a lot, because that's the main attachment figure in the room. And so I think I personally check in explicitly around that. I also in the beginning very explicitly say, trust takes time to develop. I don't expect it. I hope to earn it. You tell me when that is. And I think I personally communicate directly around that in the very beginning, and try to establish the baseline that, you know, that's earned. It's earned in this relationship, and it's earned in other relationships. And I think once you set that baseline, you can check in on it. You've created it. And I have a couple different things that I do with people specifically around trust, because it's just huge and attaching. And also, what is maybe most important is when you fail a test of trust and you didn't know that it was being run, or you didn't know how that person experienced something, being a really safe person to hear that and to work through it. Well, let me explain to you what I meant, or, you know, disengaging with those types of behaviors and saying, really being able to empathize and connect and hear more. I think ironically, that's in the reparation or repairing of trust, that can actually be the most impactful in building trust, is how you handle a criticism or when you mess up, how you repair that in the relationship.
Yes, very good, very good. When is EMDR necessary for clients and opposed to standard counseling?
So EMDR is a very specific, and so I would probably change the word from necessary to assessing if that's a good option. It's a treatment modality that's very specific. So even if I went to an EMDR, type training, I'd have to get a certificate in EMDR to actually engage. So it's very specific, and only certified EMDR therapists can implement that. So it's a whole other kind of set of training. And I think it's really it's kind of a hard question to answer, only because it's very specific. Some people that are ready to engage in EMDR specifically, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's what they stand for. That can be, and I think it's important to understand that's an option for trauma treatment. Some people go to EMDR therapy and are helped tremendously in a short amount of time, and other people don't experience that same type of healing or results. And so really talking through expectations and options, and also finding somebody in the area. Some people want Christian EMDR therapists specifically, and just kind of understanding this is a modality, what it is. You can walk as a standard therapist, walk someone through the basics of it and talk about what could be helpful about it. So it really, this is a horrible answer, but it does depend on the person and where they're at specifically with piecing together their trauma narrative, because talking about trauma is, sorry, I'm doing this thing, you move left or right in the therapy, but you have to be talking about the narrative of therapy. So if that's not an ability you have yet, or an ability you have yet to do safely within yourself, those are all important implications.
Right, very good. We have another question here. How can we build resilience in students and children in a way of equipping them to deal with traumatic incidences?
So, and that's a great question. And I think my answer falls along the lines of resilience can be mislabeled, and it can, you're so resilient, and that person's actually avoidant and withdrawn, and you're just not seeing or experiencing relationally the impact. So sometimes I think resilience can be it's not a diagnosis, but misunderstood, because I think true resilience is being able to manage emotional and affect states and work through them. Actually, I was reading just in preparation for this, and I'll just read it because I have it here, a book called Restoring the Shattered Self by Heather Gingrich. And she's actually talking about parents here, but when I was like listening to it or reading it, I was like, this is actually really applicable to us who work with children and adults. So she's talking about attachment here, and specifically insecure, disorganized attachment. So bear with me. Early childhood trauma disrupts the process of learning to regulate affect, so emotional states. It impacts that both directly and indirectly. So if the parents are perpetrators, an insecure, disorganized attachment style often develops. And because the source and the parent is both a safety figure and a danger figure to that person. So naturally disrupts the ability for the child to understand who and how to trust, because the person in charge of their care is also the perpetrator. So how that impacts them. So in addition to the impact of the abusive behavior itself, parents who maltreat their children are often deficient in other aspects of parenting, even when they're attempting to parent well. So this is where I think the application comes in for us. Such parents tend to be poor at helping children acquire control over their behavior. and I would probably replace it with teachers are sometimes poor at helping children acquire control over the behaviors. And I think that that can be a part of the classroom. They're not good at recognizing and tracking their children's emotional states, and they're not as good at intervening in ways that help disrupt inappropriate states in their children, and also are poor role models for self-control. So when I think about building resilience, I think about, like, first we'd have to have some of those skill sets, and also look for ways to implement. You need to be able to recognize and manage your emotional states. And here are some tools to do that. And I, as your caregiver or authority figure, model how to do that. I can talk about being angry or upset without losing my mind or throwing things, right? So I'm modeling that, but I'm also noting, I know you're angry right now. And when you're angry, you do this, and this is a tool we can use instead, and building that in. So I think resilience to me is, an honest kind of unflinching, we're not trying to extinguish certain emotional states, but giving someone tools to work through any trigger or emotional state that they have. I think that's what true resilience looks like to me.
Okay, excellent. And Ashlyn, can you just repeat the name of that book? Someone is asking for the name of the book.
It's called Restoring the Shattered Self. It's probably backwards. And it's a Christian counselor's guide to complex trauma, but it is very helpful. And it's by Heather Gingrich. I didn't put it up there, but I should have.
Thank you so much. We are just about out of time today. So thank you guys for all of your questions. And you will be receiving the recording of this webinar. But before we leave, I wanted to thank Ashlyn for a very helpful and very informative presentation, and for her time. It was awesome. And to also let you know that based on your feedback, Karen is offering additional resources like this webinar throughout this school year. We'll be sending you a link of today's webinar, as I mentioned, in a follow-up email, and we encourage you to share it with anyone that you think would benefit from the content. I also want to put a plug in for our Masters of Science in Counseling program, as well as our School of Education graduate programs. Ashlyn is an excellent example of the caliber faculty our counseling students as well as our education students study under. If you would like to learn more about our MSc and School of Education or any of our other graduate programs, you can visit our website to learn more, or email admissions@cairn.edu to speak with one of our counselors. We're also currently enrolling for Cairn's graduate programs for the spring semester starting January the 11th. If you're considering furthering your education or interested in auditing a class, inquire today or email the same email address to connect with one of our counselors. We are so very grateful that you were able to be a part of today's webinar. We hope that this time has been very helpful for you, and we look forward to having you join us the next time. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.